year is 1988. 30-year-old James Woods and 23-year-old David Mason have both been declared incompetent to stand trial.
1 year prior to this, they had both been charged with the murder of 49-year-old Dean Metheny in the first degree.
All three had been patients at what was then known as the Western State Hospital, a place originally meant as an asylum to those with varying degrees of mental illness. That's asylum, as in a place of refuge and protection. The idea being that those deemed mentally unsound at the time were deserving of clean and spacious living quarters, in which they could not only get the help they needed, but possibly even be cured. In summary, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, its original name, was originally built with the intention of treating the patients like actual human beings, for which, you may or may not be surprised to know, was revolutionary at the time of its construction. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride had advocated extensively for this more humane treatment of mental patients, saying there is an abundant reason why every state should make ample provisions, not only for the proper custody, but also for the most enlightened treatment of all insane within its borders. In the early 1850s, the Virginia General Assembly would give the go-ahead for the construction of the asylum. But, despite the original intentions behind the building of this space, its max 250 capacity would eventually dive into the thousands, and the once groundbreaking levels of patient care would turn into actual horrors. Fast forwarding back to the year 1987, patient Dean Metheny had spent the entire day coloring under nurse supervision. Dean had a learning disability that made him essentially have the mental capacity of a small child, as well as making him unable to actually speak. Eventually, said nurse would escort him up to Ward F, a place designated for the more violent patients within the asylum. He was being roomed here due to his occasional tendency to act out. He was placed into a room with two other patients, named, you guessed it, David Mason and James Woods, whom of which was known around the ward as Big Jim. Now, before we delve further into the actions of these two men, it is absolutely paramount to understand that it is reported that David hated those that had been deemed by and large by society at the time as, please excuse my use of this historical term as it pertains to the story, mentally retarded. These two took one look at Dean and had already made up their minds. One night, they pulled him from his bed, and using some bed sheets they had meticulously tied together, they wrapped them around his neck, proceeding to hang him from the ceiling until he'd eventually pass out. Then, they'd let him down, and just as he would start to come to, they'd do it again, repeating this process multiple times. At this point, the two had grown exceedingly angry that Dean was still breathing, so they lowered him one last time and pulled the bed over, positioning it to where the leg of said bed was placed right over Dean's temple. They then would take turns jumping up and down on the mattress until the post had pierced right through his skull. This would be known as the bedpost murder. One would like to think that events like this would have been scarce, far and few between. However, this is just one of the many of happenings of that place. Place that even back then was quoted as being haunted by the former patients that had lost their lives there. People will often leave toys, candy, and even attempt to play games with the spirits of those at the asylum. This includes Dean. One report speaks of a group of people whom had arrived with the intentions to do just that. And like many, they were successful. They had managed to establish communication using what is known as the Estes method. What came through, though, was whom the group believed to be Dean's spirit. However, their interaction with him would be cut short. Soon, all that was heard was the sounds of screaming, likely in response to the return of one of the very men whom had taken his life. Another entity, whom is known to interact with guests, is that of a little girl named Lily.
There are many variations to Lily's story, one even stating that she is actually a grown man or a demonic entity pretending to be a little girl in order to either rock people into a false sense of security, which is quite common for demonic beings to do, or, in the case of it actually being a man, to simply garner attention. Whatever the truth may or may not be, Lily's supposed story is as follows. During the American Civil War, a woman named Gladys had been left alone in her home by her husband, abandoned. A group of raiding soldiers would then break in and take it upon themselves to not only verbally harass and degrade her, but also to rape her. The trauma of this event understandably proved to be too much, and it is said she had went mad, at which point she was committed to the asylum. Unfortunately, as time would tell, it would be discovered that Gladys was pregnant, and in 1863, Lily was born. At this point, the story wavers between Lily having lived only a few hours to making it to as old as 9, stating that she would eventually succumb to pneumonia. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had been only one of 4 sites approved to perform lobotomies on patients in the 1950s, and they did so for just about anything, thinking it as a cure-all for mental illness. The procedures of these lobotomies would involve inserting an ice pick-like device into the eye sockets and maneuvering it in such a way as to disconnect the neural pathways of the prefrontal cortex. This would effectively rid said individual of any and all emotions, making a once violent or depressed patient no longer such. However, this also meant the patient would no longer really emotionally feel anything. No happiness, no joy, leaving them a shell of their former selves. They simply just exist. Most would come out the other end of the procedure needing lifelong help with the most basic of tasks, and others would simply die of a brain hemorrhage when in recovery, if not outright on the operating table, which was often made a spectacle to the public, some doctors deciding even to use 2 hands at once in order to awe the crowd. That is, while they were operating. It's said some 900 lobotomies had been done on the premises, some even quoting the number as high as 4,000. There's a lot more to be said about this asylum. Patients locked into the ice baths, feces-covered bathrooms, patient-on-patient violent electroshock therapy, of course, definitely murder. Even the staff was not safe from the atrocities within. One female staff member in particular had went missing for 2 whole months, eventually being discovered long dead and decayed at the bottom of an unused staircase. There were reports of shadow figures peeking around corners, a mimic that'll copy the voices of those you know. And on the 4th floor, a creature known as the Creeper, whom crawls along on all 4s, doing so not only on the floor, but the walls and ceilings as well. This place has been riddled with cruel act after cruel act, to such an extent that many patients have attempted burning the entire thing to the ground, while many others, defeated in the reality inside the walls of what was essentially a torturous hell, would commit suicide. Any way you can look at this place, it's difficult not to get lost in remembrance of what it had been, of what had happened there, to lament those whom once had no choice but to be within its walls. And I hope that we, the people of today, whom tend to believe ourselves to be so progressive, can take a page from this and never repeat the actions and events that led to the existence of such a place. But of course, humanity in all areas of history have crowned what they presumed as the new and modern way of doing things to be the best way of doing things, and in the name of pioneering, tread forth these ideas without a second thought to the consequences of such actions. And as said, it was well less than 100 years ago that lobotomies were performed without a second thought, doctors making such a practice of spectacles for those who watched, and while today we look back at this in abject horror, many around back then saw no real problem with it. One can only wonder what new and modern practices we do now will be considered inhumane in a little less than 100 years' time. Here's to hoping whatever it is, we don't rush into making it a highly encouraged mainstream practice. And at a close, I must thank you for watching. I did a lot of research for this video. If you liked it, please like it, and if you have anything to add, please do comment it below. I'd love to read what you have to say. And if you'd like to see more videos from me in the future, subscribe. Until next time, I love every single one of you.